Significant influx of talent this offseason. Projecting the Jets' 53-man roster isn't quite as easy as it's been in years past. I'm Glenn Naughton with Jet Nation Radio and JetNation.com. Be sure to log into JetNation.com where you can register and become a part of what is the most active Jets message board on the web. I am joined, as always, won't be live on camera with us tonight, but here to talk to us, audio, Chris Schubert. How we doing, Chris?
I would be better if I had my video set up for us all here tonight. I brought my laptop to work. Everybody knows I work at a radio station. Brought my laptop to work, which has my camera on it. Left the charger at home. Used the laptop throughout the day. Realized I didn't have the charger. And so now I'm in what I could only describe as a box here at the radio station in which I'm using other equipment that I don't know. So if I sound bad, I'm going to blame the equipment, not me. So if I make any bad takes, it's the equipment's fault. It's not my fault tonight.
All right, man in the box. Shout out Allison Chains. So, Chris, we're going to touch on a few topics tonight. The key one being, of course, the 53-man roster. I've always hated doing 53-man rosters way too early, and this is definitely way too early. But it intrigues me more than years past because in looking at the roster after the draft, I kind of came to the realization that there are a lot fewer roster spots up for grabs. Like if you look at the guys who we view as this guy is a lock to make it, even the guys who maybe, could get edged out, like for example, a Wes Schweitzer, I would still at this point count him as a lock because he is a proven veteran and we've not seen, nobody else, none of the rookies, the UDFAs, the less experienced guys, nobody's taken a snap yet, even preseason. And, that's obviously when we'll be able to get a better grasp on what's going on. But your thoughts, though, Chris, this year's roster, looking at it top to bottom, just ballpark it. How many roster spots do you look at right now and say that one's up for grabs? I think 3 or 4 spots are out there to be had, maybe a little more. But in years past, you felt like there were a dozen open spots, 10 open spots, because the team had such a lack of talent that if somebody stepped up, they could steal a roster spot. Not the case right now.
No, and I think it's easy to have a conversation of where I think the strongest position battles are going to be in training camp and in the preseason. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. But if we are discussing how many total roster spots of the 53-man are going to be up for grabs, I mean, it's a handful, right? It's not a lot. It's not the length in which we have debated this in the past. And honestly, Glenn, I think it has a lot to do with where we think the roster composition is going to be, because some teams will only take a certain number of receivers. And so that's just going to automatically rule some people out. And so I think we have to probably do a deep dive into what Joe Douglas and company have done in the past in that regard. How many receivers have they taken? Do they carry 10 offensive linemen, right? What does that depth look like? How many additional secondary pieces are they willing to carry into the 2024 campaign? And that'll give us, I think, a bit of an inkling of who's going to be on the margins and who's going to be competing for a roster spot. I'm looking right now at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 names. For me personally, 5 names of guys that I think are going to have really good camps to find themselves in prime position to be starters and or depth pieces for this team in 2024. So if you want to say that those are where the roster spots are, I've got about 5 or 6.
Yeah, and I think a couple of spots that jump out at me that we will not know until the season starts, obviously. Joe Douglas has said he wants the Jets to be a quarterback factory. They're carrying right now. We were all happy with the addition of Tyrod Taylor because he's such an upgrade over what they had previously, but it would be silly to ignore his injury history. He's not a durable guy. If Aaron Rodgers, God forbid, were to get injured again and be on the shelf for, say, 6-7 games, there's a good chance Tyrod Taylor is going to get hurt at some point during those 6 or 7 games. And then it becomes, do you trust a rookie in Jordan Travis to go out there and play a few games for you? Or do you look at a veteran in camp? And I'm not saying they should or will. I just think, especially with Douglas's comments, like I think they really do want legitimate depth and produce quarterbacks. Of course, at running back, I'm the biggest Izzy Abanikanda guy out there. I can't see them keeping him. I think someone tweeted at me or told me that Bart Scott predicted Izzy Abanikanda like they would carry 4. I have a really difficult time seeing that. I would like it because I like Izzy, but I don't know that that'll happen. And you mentioned it. Do they carry 10 O linemen? That to me is the biggest one because with all the injuries last year, we've heard the numbers, 15 linemen, a million combinations, all that stuff. They've really made an effort to go out and improve that offensive line this year. 3 free agents, a rookie. That alone right there, that's 4. If you're carrying 9, that's nearly half your line in the guys you've brought in. Those guys aren't going anywhere, obviously. But if Joe Douglas, with this sort of renewed determination to make his offensive line disaster proof by having guys who can step right in and play at a high level, like the thing last year, of course, you had Becton and Brown, and you kind of everyone knew, similar to this year, one of those guys is going to miss significant time at some point, if not both. Now, they were lucky in that Becton stayed healthy, but not so lucky in how he played. But of course, Brown did get hurt. They move AVT to tackle, which was the backup plan, and then he gets hurt. And then Schweitzer backfills AVT and he gets hurt. So does Joe Douglas say, after what I saw last year, I'm carrying 10. I'm getting 10, 11, 12 guys who I believe can play in the league. I'm carrying 10 of them. I'm putting 2 on my practice squad. That becomes the question. 9 historically, I think, is what they've usually done. But you touched on it, and that was probably the thing I struggled with most in looking at the depth chart and projecting that. But before we get to that, even Chris, I'm not sure when you heard the news, and if anyone out there, and let's see, Captain Techno and Smoke Cloud, how we doing, guys? Thanks for jumping in the chat. The Jets are letting go of 3 of their highest ranking members of their training staff. Now, if you remember a few years ago, the Jets said they were going to sort of revolutionize, or maybe not revolutionize, but make major changes, take a new approach to injury prevention. And they created this entire new wing of their training staff that was going to monitor, historic trends and figure out ways to avoid injuries. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it certainly feels like things got worse since that addition was made to the staff. The Jets announced today they're keeping the department, but the 3 highest ranking trainers in that department are being let go. All I can say to that is I would have done it after last year, after all the injuries you saw the previous season, and then things only got worse this year. But any thoughts there?
Plenty. And I'll start with this. Are they changing the turf at MetLife Stadium? Are they able to tell their players like Elijah Vera Tucker and Breece Hall that the freak injuries that they had when they were in Denver that one year, they have a new method to make sure those players don't have those types of injuries? I mean, yes, listen, this team has had more injuries than I think we could even count here on the show if we tried to go through it. And I get that. And overhauling your sports science is the new fad right now for everybody, right? Everyone's trying to be revolutionary, cutting edge. They're trying to be in front of the curve when it comes to sports science. So I'm not going to, bash the Jets for doing that. But when I think of the last couple major injuries for the New York Jets, the 3 names that immediately jumped to mind for me, Glenn, when you were having that conversation, was Aaron Rodgers' Achilles injury, and then Elijah Vera Tucker and Breece Hall both hurting themselves in Denver. Sports science ain't going to fix those 3 injuries. There's nothing that they can do from a preparation standpoint that's going to fix the MetLife turf potentially being the thing that doomed Aaron Rodgers. They have nothing that they can do about, freak injuries that happened in Denver when Breece Hall and Elijah Vera Tucker got hurt. So I get it. They might be able to help with some soft tissue stuff and might be able to have some more performance-based things that really help these guys stay, in the best shape they can throughout the season to help with those types of things. But when I think of the major injuries that this team has had in recent memory that have absolutely, hurt this team's ability to reach the heights we think they can, I don't think a new sports science or a new, training department is going to fix those things.
Yeah, I think that's part of it too, right? So, I mean, and I think they've acknowledged as much that some injuries aren't preventable, but the number of injuries they've had are just so alarming. And it's been several years now that I felt like, yeah, something needs to change there. Even within the training. And, the thing is, you don't know when this stuff happens, if it's the coach being intentionally misleading or if the training staff is giving him bad info. But we've seen a handful of instances where Robert Saleh will offer a recovery time, and it is not a little bit wrong, but off by months. Mekhi Becton, they said, would be 5 weeks. That ended up being essentially 2 years. Now I get it, there was the re-injury, but even the fact it took a year when they said it might be 5 weeks with the knee. Again, I don't know if that was the staff being bad at their jobs or Saleh for some reason trying to keep the fan base calm and like when your pilot knows it's going to be a 3-hour delay and he just tells you it's going to be 15 minutes, 12 different times.
They're just finishing up
Um,
some paperwork up at the front. That's all they got to do. Finish up some paperwork, and then we're going to get right out of here.
all right. Yeah, so that basically I wondered if that was Salah being overly optimistic or overly cautious and not wanting to tell people right off the bat, hey, Mackay's done for the year, which maybe they didn't know. Maybe him not dropping the weight did contribute to him missing as much time as he did. But anyway, a change is happening, and it was time for a change to happen. So
So
hopefully,
real quick, Glenn, hold on. Real quick. Did you not understand my joke? I know you can't see me, so that might have gotten in the way. But my paperwork joke was the pilot when he comes over the speaker and he goes, "Oh, we're just finishing up some paperwork up here in the front. We're going
I
to be
did
out of
not
here."
get that at all. And yeah,
And that's
it's not being
I
able to
need
see
your
you. I thought,
reaction.
oh, someone walked in on Chris and he forgot
No,
to hit mute. I thought that's what
no.
happened.
No, I was making a joke that every time that there's a
Yes,
delay on my plane, they go, "No, we're just finishing up some paperwork up here in the front. We're going to be
yes.
pushing back here in a little bit." And then 45 minutes goes by. But based on the way that you just awkwardly transitioned and the face that you made, I could tell that you thought I was talking to somebody else. So I
Yeah,
felt like I
I
needed to
was like, what's going on right now?
yeah, before we moved
I was
on.
a
Yeah,
little
I
bit
felt like I needed to
confused.
just yeah.
No, but you're right though, and that's it's there's always some story about why they have to wait another 15 minutes, and then they wait half an hour and tell you it's going to be another 15 minutes, and they just repeat that for however long they have to. Because think about it, if you're on the plane, they say, "Hey guys, we're going to be on the tarmac for the next 3.5 hours." You're going to have a damn riot.
Yeah, chaos will
Um,
break out.
what's that?
I said chaos will break out if you just
Yeah,
tell the people in the front
exactly,
how long it's going to be.
exactly. So again, whether it was the training staff being wrong, Salah being wrong, doesn't matter. They've made some changes. I think it was time for that to happen. You're trying to avoid major injury bug yet again. So getting into the roster though, Chris. So like I said, I don't know how many, and we'll go position by position, but of course, we're gonna have the fringe guys. A guy like Max Mitchell, who we've discussed. Do the Jets give him a look at guard and tackle to maybe increase the chances of him making the roster? And could some guy surprise? There's always the chance of that happening. But so for quarterback, I'll just run through what I have as my green lights, the guys who I think are going to make the roster. For quarterback, I've got Rodgers, Taylor, and uh, Travis. I'm sure you have the same there.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but with the third quarterback rule, he doesn't have to be on the active roster on game day, so they might be able to play
Correct.
some tricks with that throughout the course of the season with their practice squad. And if injuries occur, they can elevate some different people. But I think the main premise of what we're trying to do here is yes, I think Aaron Rodgers, Tyrod Taylor, and Jordan Travis will be the three quarterbacks that make this football team for 2024.
Yeah, and so the only reason, and I said this, like I said, I'm a bit of an Izzy homer, and I'm hoping he makes it. I think you can have, it's not uncommon for this team to carry a guy or two who primarily play special teams. And I think I look at Isaiah, and I've heard people say it. Is Isaiah Davis a guy they drafted to develop as a back, but who could also be a factor on return, given the new set of rules and his running style, his combination of power and speed? So I've got Izzy making it, but that's a very, very tentative decision there. So that gives me Brees Hall, Braylon Allen, I think will be RB2. And then I've got Izzy and Isaiah Davis, with Davis being used primarily on special teams.
Yeah, we agree there, and I'll just add to this: Isaiah Davis was a returner in college, and I think the way this breaks down is Brees Hall your RB1. I think Braylon Allen just is the perfect complementary piece to Brees Hall, and I think
Mm-hmm.
that's going to put him as the RB2. I think his ability to pass protect, I think his ability to pass catch, I think the thunder to Brees Hall's lightning is, I think, going to be the attractive feature there to make him the RB2. And then you're looking at Izzy Abanikanda and Isaiah Davis battling it out for RB3. But Glenn, you brought up the point I was going to bring up. These new return rules, these new special team rules, this is our first opportunity to see how roster construction is going to be different with those rules in place. And I look at this team right now, and let's take Isaiah Davis out of it for just a moment. Xavier Gibson would be the primary return guy for this team right now. If you had to say somebody not Isaiah Davis, that's the guy you're probably looking at. So I wonder if they want to give somebody else a look, and Isaiah Davis ultimately fits that profile. So I'm going to say they only carry three because until I see them do it with the specific set of circumstances where they are using a player in special teams, I just won't believe it until I see it. So I will say that Braylon Allen makes the team and Izzy Abanikanda doesn't. And so you're looking at Brees Hall, Braylon Allen, and Isaiah Davis as the three players. And Izzy gets traded, or he's a cut, or late camp, or something like that. But is there a world where this is the quote unquote surprise and they keep four running backs? Absolutely. I think that is absolutely on the table. But for the sake of predicting this right now, I'll just say three, because until I see them do it, I'm just not sure.
And we gotta give a quick shout out in the chat. This might be a first. Our friend Peter LaFontaine watching from Mongolia. Thanks for the content. Hoping to see Stiggers make the team and do well. I think Stiggers makes the team because there's so little depth at corner.
We'll get there. We'll get there, but he's making the team.
Yeah, yeah. Mongolia, awesome. I've been closest I've been is China. Had some friends who did some time in the military out in that neck of the woods. Loved it. And Attila the Hun read a book on him last year. Incredible story. Incredible figure. Let's see. Charles in the chat says, good evening. Like the draft. Could use another receiver. I don't disagree there. Could have signed DJ Chark. I like Chark, but you can't bring in a guy who's as injured as he is. Alan Lazard. Lazard's a good question. I asked this the other day on the forums at Jet Nation. Is he a guy who could we see a bit of a resurgence? And I'm not talking 8, 9, 1,000 yards. I'm talking, can he catch most of the balls they throw his way and put up 500 yards as the third, fourth receiver? That would be nice. As far as making a deal with the Broncos, the Jets are just so cap strapped right now. I don't know what they'll be doing there. My info says why they let go of Pee Wee. Pee Wee tweeted out it was an injury agreement, that he was still recovering from something, and the team let him go. Moving on. Do you think? I don't think they carry a fullback. I don't think Bawden makes the roster this year. Really? I said this last year, Chris, and this infuriated me really. Okay. To me, Bawden should have never made the roster, and Ruckert should have been your fullback. And as soon as Ruckert steps in at fullback, whatever it was, week 15, 16, he was absolutely demolishing people, opening up running lanes. Yeah. I say you move on from Bawden, you let Ruckert stay and play fullback.
I'll tell you, that might be a way to get the 4 tight ends making the team. If you make Jeremy Ruckert your de facto fullback, and then you can carry 3 other tight ends. So I like the inventiveness there, if that's even a word. I think I might have just made it up, to utilize these roster spots to their fullest potential. Because I'll tell you what, Glenn, if you're going to go to tight end next, I'd love to have that conversation, because I don't know who doesn't make the team. It's probably Kenny Yeboah is the guy that doesn't make the team out of those 4. But if you're able to, maybe you don't keep Bowden, you make Ruckert the quote-unquote fullback, that's your tricky way to keep all 4 guys on the roster. I'd be on board with that.
Yeah, I think let's do that since we started. We'll go back. We'll double back to wide receiver. We'll do tight end. Yeboah is the guy who I have in the red, not making the team. Not to overreact to stuff, but and some people did way overreact. This is not so much. This is a matter of knowing this guy was going to need time to develop. I think guys want to give their draft picks a shot. I think Zach Kuntz has a shot to stick as the third guy, as the third tight end. Now, Aaron Rodgers, I think on McAfee a couple weeks ago, mentioned Kuntz by name as a guy who he was building some chemistry with. I think he said had a lot of fun throwing the ball to Kuntz late in the year on the scout team. Now, listen, this guy, we've said it. Everyone has said it. Athletic freak, freak of nature, the size, height, speed, vert combo, all that stuff packaged into one makes him one of the most, athletically gifted tight ends on the planet. He was going to need time to develop. We knew that. This isn't the case of the Jets drafting an athlete, hoping he can learn to play football. This is the Jets drafting an incredibly athletic football player who came out of a small program and may have needed some time. I will say, Kuntz, from what I saw on film and what we saw from him in the preseason with the Jets, much better blocker than I thought he would be. And when I say film, I should have specified what I saw from him in college as a blocker versus what he did with the Jets in training camp. I felt like he'd already made some significant strides there. If he's continued to do that, I think he makes the roster. That gives you Conklin, Ruckert, Kuntz, and Ruckert as the de facto fullback. Yeboah, I think, again, because there are so few spots, I've got him on the outside looking in.
Yeah, I think that's your ticket to making the team. If you're Zach Kuntz, is your ability to block, right? I mean, if that has taken a step to where it is serviceable at the NFL level, you are going to be able to be in the rotation, and that's an important thing. And listen, I don't want to do this all summer long, but I will. The Green Bay Packers had a lot of success last season with Kraft and Musgrave as 2 tight ends, and I wonder Nathaniel Hackett was over there running that offense, and they didn't have two tight ends to the caliber of Kraft and Musgrave there when Rodgers was there for the back-to-back MVP seasons. But I do wonder if there will be some flavor of that where they try to get Conklin and Ruckert on the field at the same time. And at some point, maybe Zach Kuntz can get into that rotation as well, and you have some athletic playmakers, kind of like what we were thinking would be the case if this team, sorry to bring this up, Glenn, if they drafted Brock Bowers, of how they would be able to utilize multiple tight ends on the field at the same time.
Brock who?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, he doesn't matter to you anymore.
No, no. No, you're right though, and that's that we know they do like to run a lot of two tight end stuff, but that's another thing that makes Ruckert alluring is if you line him up at fullback, and if Kuntz does make some progress, you lining him up with Conklin gives you a pretty nice set of targets for Rodgers to work with. I
Sure.
think too much.
If
I
I
think too
believed
much.
in the offensive coordinator to be creative enough to use all those players, yes, but yeah, that's another conversation for a different podcast.
It is, and it's one of the frustrating. It's when I think about what we opened up with the quarterbacks, like how many do you keep? There's that part of me going, no matter how many you keep, who's developing the young guys, and that doesn't give you a whole lot of hope. Um, let's see. Charles, real quick in the chat says extend Brees Hall, Michael Carter, and Jermaine Johnson at the end of the year. I'd put this tag on Riddick at the end of the season. I think try to get him done now and bring his number down. As far as Brees Hall, I mean, listen, Brees, I wouldn't be surprised if Sauce, JJ, and Garrett, if one, two, or all three of them want new deals after this season, this could be an interesting offseason, let's put it that way. And especially, it's going to be really interesting. Of the four, Brees is going to be the most interesting because of the running back market. Teams don't pay running backs. If he has a monster year and wants a contract, we'll have to see what the Jets do there. But I don't think Joe Douglas would want to see him leave. But if he does a thing where he runs for 1,500 yards this year and wants to be the number one paid back in the NFL, the Jets are going to have some decisions to make. So, like I said, we'll double back to wide receiver. I have Garrett Wilson, Mike Williams, Malachi Corley. I've got Lazard. I've got Brownlee, and I've got Gibson in yellow. I've got him right behind Brownlee. I think that he's thinking back to what the Jets said about Brownlee pre-draft last year. They, even though yes, he was a UDFA, they believed he had a fourth round grade with the possibility to develop into a starting receiver. That's what led me to give Jason Brownlee the bump. Would they carry six receivers? I don't know. Irv Charles is an interesting one because I think that he was part of the reason I thought they would let Justin Hardy go. Charles was phenomenal on coverage, on special teams coverage as a gunner once Hardy was injured last year. But of course, they also brought in Isaiah Oliver, and that's the role he fills. So is it going to be Oliver, or do they keep Irv Charles around as an elite? And Robert Saleh said it, when he was asked why Irv Charles over anyone else, and he just said he's a monster on special teams, and he absolutely is. He absolutely was. So is that enough to keep him on the roster as a receiver? It's going to come down to him and maybe one or two other guys. So I've got Charles on the outside looking in as well, but wouldn't surprise me if either he or Gibson make the roster as starters or as 53 man.
I think it's six that'll ultimately come out of this group. I think Garrett Wilson, Mike Williams, Malachi Corley are your top three. I'm sorry, Glenn. I think Jason Brownlee is ahead of Alan Lazard on this depth chart right now. I think Jason Brownlee is going to be the fourth wide receiver. I think Alan Lazard, until he proves that he is the player that he was with Aaron Rodgers in Green Bay, is the fifth wide receiver. And then I think you're looking at a battle between Xavier Gibson, Irv Charles, maybe Malik Taylor is also involved in that position battle to be the last wide receiver. But you mentioned Irv Charles' special teams ability. They'll find ways to get guys on the roster who can excel at special teams, especially with the new rules. I think you're going to see that start to be a part of the roster construction. But again, like I was talking about with the running backs, I just don't know how they're going to deploy those roster spots with the new rules. And so it's a bit of a guessing game on how they're going to do it. And so for right now, I think the four that are locks are Garrett Wilson, Mike Williams, Malachi Corley, and Jason Brownlee, in my opinion. I think if they can find a taker for Lazard's money, he's out of here. I think they would love to trade him, and I think that would free up a spot to potentially solve this problem that they have with a bit of a logjam with some of these guys that they like, and who knows who else could become available via cuts or who's still available via free agency. So that's kind of how I see the wide receiver room at this stage.
Yeah, I've been wondering that for a few weeks with Lazard because, yes, you're taking on a cap hit if you release him, But as bad as he was last year, and it'll free up 3 million, and the team acquiring him will have to pay him 8, and that's the 8 million that the Jets will take on a hit. But if they could get a seventh rounder or do a pick swap, Zach Wilson style, for Alan Lazard, I would have no issue with that because again, having said, I think they view Brownlee as a guy who can develop into a starting level player. That would be
When
to
was
me. What's that?
no, sorry, I did not mean to interrupt you. I was just thinking out loud. When was cut day last year? Do you know? Was it late in
I
August?
forget. I mean, it's right before. It's within. No. It's normally a few days before the final preseason game, isn't it?
Okay, because I have the depth chart from
I'm drawing a
September
blank
1st.
on that.
I have the depth chart from September 1st, 2023. Okay, so I have the depth
Hmm.
chart from September 1 of last year, and they carried 7 wide receivers: Garrett Wilson,
Right.
Al Lazard, Miko Hardman, Irv Charles, Jason Brownlee, Randall Cobb, Xavier Gibson. So you replace Miko Hardman with Malachi Corley. You replace Alan Lazard with Mike Williams. You move Lazard into Randall Cobb's spot, and you basically run back that same group. If you're going to keep 7,
See, and I would the thing with going with 5. That's literally because I'm so tired of every single year. I say they're going to keep 6, maybe even 7, and they never they might on opening day, and then when once the season starts, they cut down to 5, maybe 6, but even
yep,
rarely 6.
they had
So
7 last year on
I'm
September
what's
1st.
that?
They had 7 on September 1st last year. So
Right, right. But which would have been when was the season opener though? Because
September
that's
11th was 10
yeah.
days before
So
the season opener.
they probably and I think that's when did they IR Cobb? I feel like they were able to, and somebody was who was suspended for a game. Eccles was suspended for a game, but however it shook out, because I remember being happy about that and being like, oh, they're keeping this many, but they tend to trim down. I would love for them to keep 6, just because today's game it's so passing oriented. Like I want guys on the roster getting reps in game and practice and developing guys.
Yeah.
But
Now to that
I
point,
put 5 because I'm tired of being wrong every time I say 6.
in season, so I looked at the depth charts from October 1st, November 1st, December 1st. That's the way our lads breaks it down. They had
Okay,
6. They had 6 every time. For every depth chart I'm looking, they carried 6. So it was
awesome.
7 on the opening of the season, and then they moved guys around. So or
And I
initially 4.
actually and having said at the top, Chris, that I've got 3 or 4 roster spots not filled. I've probably and a guy we haven't mentioned, and I'm not predicting. I don't know what's going to happen, but Tyler Harrell's an interesting guy, Chris. I shot out a few tweets about him before his pro day, saying keep an eye on what this kid runs. There were reports that he ran a 4.19 when he visited Louisville. He played at a few different colleges. He played at Miami, played at Louisville, played at was it Alabama? I think he went from Alabama to Louisville to Miami, if I'm not mistaken, or Miami to Louisville. And not a very productive guy. Only had 1 year where he had a solid amount of targets, and all he did was average 29 yards per catch. He had like 18 catches for around 500 yards. It was ridiculous. That's how fast he ended up at his pro day. He ended up running a 4.28. So there was hype that he ran a 4.19 a year or two earlier. 4.28 still pretty fast, and this is a guy, we've heard Joe Douglas talk about how much he wants, game breakers and speed guys who can make explosive plays. You get Aaron Rodgers throwing the ball on target the way he does, and a guy running a 4.28, trying to get open underneath and pick up yards after the catch. Harrell is a guy to keep an eye on. And also, I mean, we should mention Marcus Riley, right? They gave him 2.3 million, I believe, as a UDFA. That you don't see UDFAs get that kind of money very often.
No,
Um,
no.
yeah, and this was a guy he played at was it Florida A&M, and then he went to
Yep.
no, sorry, from Bethune
Nope.
Cookman
To Florida
to
A&M.
then I think to Florida A&M, where he again another speedster, another guy utilized underneath, good yards after the catch player. But the Jets must have really liked him to give him 2.3 million. They were obviously outbidding other teams. So there are listen, if they keep 6, I'd be over the moon. And if they dealt Lazard and kept 6, I'd be even happier. Like
Mm-hmm.
get Lazard out of the building, elevate Brownlee, and let me see someone like Gibson, Tyler Harrell, or Marcus Riley, somebody like that, stick around. Offensive tackle, Chris. There
Oh
are
boy.
the there are the 4 very obvious: Tyron Smith, Morgan Moses, Olu Fashanu, Carter Warren. And I love this because listen, Carter Warren, he's got a year under his belt now. You hope
Mhm.
there's a year of development, a year of progress. You now believe you've got two backup tackles who aren't going to, it's not the end of the world that the starters miss a few games. We hope. We have no idea how Fashanu will perform. We don't know that Carter Warren will make the next step. But, we've talked about Warren probably a little bit more than most folks, Chris. I think I like him because I think that based on how he played last year was not great. But taking into consideration the fact he didn't have a camp, he missed all of the previous season, minus a few snaps, didn't have a training camp. Like, I don't know how much some people expected of him. I just thought go in there and don't embarrass yourself. Like you've not taken an NFL snap before and you're getting thrown into it without a camp. He had some good moments. Yes, he had some bad, but I thought he looked good enough that it was encouraging. Then, of course, there's Fashanu. Max Mitchell is the guy who's the bubble guy to me. And also worth mentioning, Obina Azie was given he's the Jets international player exemption. TCU product, really good footwork. Went back and watched some of his games from a couple of years ago. He's a project, but for a guy who immigrated and didn't play football growing up, didn't start playing football till late high school and lands in the NFL, he's a project, but there's definitely some upside there.
When I look at this group, Glenn, I see the two starters in Tyron Smith and Morgan Moses. I see Olufushanu as the first man up on either side. And I know this is going to be a fun conversation that we can have all throughout the year. But I think if something were to happen to Morgan Moses, Olufushanu would get the first crack at right tackle. And then Carter Warren would be the next man up after that. And then there's the interior, right? Because I think those four are solid. I think Tyron Smith, Morgan Moses, Olufushanu, and Carter Warren give you your four. And so now you're thinking if they carry 9, you have 5 other spots. So John Simpson, Joe Tippmann, Elijah Vera Tucker, that's 3. So you've got 2 other spots for Xavier Newman, Wes Schweitzer, and Max Mitchell. Now, I'll tell you right now, I think that group is subpar, and that is an area that this team needs to address here between now and the beginning of the season. There are opportunities to upgrade from this group. If you had to ask me right now, I still think they'll just take 9, and it'll be Max Mitchell and Wes Schweitzer would be the 2 to round out the 9, and Xavier Newman is the guy that is on the outside looking in.
Yeah, I've got Tippmann and Schweitzer, of course, at center. Schweitzer can play guard as well. We know that. Simpson and Vera Tucker is your starters. Schweitzer is the guy who can play either spot. And a guy who I thought looked okay-ish last year, again, didn't play a ton of reps. Jake Hansen, who was a free agent. They brought him back. I think he could be in the mix for a roster spot. Chris Glazer, a guy who, another one who hasn't played much, but they've brought that guy back about 6 times. Like they like something about him. Whether or not that translates into him making the roster, I don't know. But he was active at times last year. If you look at his transaction history, he's been on and off the Jets many times over. Xavier Newman, who you mentioned, and then of course there's the UDFA from Arkansas, Brady Latham. I don't know. I think he's more of a practice squad guy at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got Smith, Moses, Fashanu, Warren, AVT, Simpson, Hansen with Tippmann and Schweitzer. But I think the right move is to work Max Mitchell in at guard a little bit and give you another guy who has some guard tackle flexibility.
Yeah, and I think that's what allows me to think that Wes and Max will have the edge, because if you have Wes who can play all 3 spots along the interior, again, is he a top tier option at those spots? No, but he has that flexibility. And if you get Mitchell the flexibility to play at either spot along the right guard, I mean, let's be honest, Glenn, Elijah Vera Tucker is not the epitome of health, and Morgan Moses has missed some time in the past as well. So having other bodies that you can trust on that right side. And listen, we know how this is going to go. They say out loud that Elijah Vera Tucker is their starting right guard. Elijah Vera Tucker is their starting right guard. I think if there's an injury anywhere, they're just going to move AVT. Like that is just what they're going to do in case of an injury. They're going to move AVT around. And I think Olufushanu also profiles as a guy that can play either tackle spot if they need to in a pinch. So I think those are the things that I'm keeping an eye on for OTAs, for mini camp, for training camp, and for preseason.
All right, real quick in the chat, Charles says suggest
Charles
maybe
writing novels for us. Novels.
Charles wants to move DJ Reed and a pick and have Stiggers as your starter. Stiggers has to show something first, Charles. I think I'm extending DJ Reed if I'm the Jets. Another guy whose cap number for this year you can bring down if you move him. But listen, it's not out of the beyond the realm of possibility though, Chris. They can't keep everybody, and in the next 1 to 2 years.
For this year, they can. And
this year. That's what I'm saying. But beyond this year, maybe they are looking forward and saying, you know what, we're going to let DJ's contract expire. We're going to get a third round comp pick because he's going to get a huge deal somewhere. And maybe Stiggers moves up. Again, this isn't what I'm advocating for. I'm just saying. And, this is a problem the Jets haven't had in a very long time. But over the next 1 to 2 years, when you factor in the Aaron Rodgers cap hit that for his monster deal, for his big year, $60 million hit, something in that range, and then over the next year or two, and then you look at Sauce and Garrett and JJ and Brees and Michael Carter and DJ Reed, that's a whole lot of money. I know the Jets are going to have some cap space. They're not going to have that kind of cap space. And
Sure.
by the way, they will be adding free agents in that time.
Yes,
So
but I ask anybody who is eager, and Charles appears to be eager to just absolutely do everything in his power to move DJ Reed now. I would ask you to do the exercise with us and look at the cornerback depth chart for
it's
the New York
terrible.
Jets. If they move DJ Reed, it is a disaster. Disaster. They are one injury away to Sauce, DJ Reed, or Michael Carter to being in a really bad place. Like, really bad.
Yeah, and I think I can't remember if it was on draft day or in the final show before, I forget. But somewhere very close to the draft, I brought up the point. I said, I think what I said was, I know the Jets don't have a lot of depth at corner, but when I looked at it on paper, it was horrifying. It was
It's brutal
it's like, yeah, I already know that. There's something about it, Chris, psychologically, when
when
you,
you see it. Yeah,
yeah, when it's in
yeah,
front of your
yeah.
eyes, it's like,
And you know
I
that
knew
you're
they
one
were
snap
thin.
away from Isaiah Oliver or Brandon Eccles or a 5th-round draft pick in Quantez Stiggers taking
Yes.
snaps for your team.
Yeah, in a big spot like that. Like, I'm okay with Eccles for a game or two, like here and there, but long term, Stiggers, it's ugly basically, and I really, that's why I look at a guy like Al Blades, who I think they've listed as a safety, the Duke DB, who I thought, but
He is listed as a safety, yes.
yeah, and one of the interesting guys here though, Chris, and I've got him making the roster. We'll start the defense here in a second. We'll actually start at this position. We'll start in the secondary because that's what we're talking about, and we'll start at safety, where Jared Bernard Converse. Sometimes he's listed as a safety, sometimes he's listed as a corner, sometimes he's referred to as a corner, and other times a safety. Talked to Nick Faria on Play Like a Jet a couple weeks ago, and he said that he kind of thinks the Jets are going to cross train him and have Jared Bernard Converse as a guy who could play either one. After they drafted him, when I went back and looked at some of his college film before he transferred to LSU, I think it was against Kentucky, if I'm not mistaken. I'm actually almost certain it was. And listen, maybe I just happened to pick the right game to highlight his ability to play corner, but I think he had 3 PBUs in the first, like before halftime, and running stride for stride with receivers downfield, well timed on, elevating, getting his hand up, and I see I see 3 of them in 10 minutes, and I'm like, I think this guy can play some corner. They may have drafted him as a safety, but I've got Bernard Converse making it with Tony Adams, Chuck Clark, Ashton Davis. Those are my safeties. Jalen Key as a fringe possible practice squad guy.
I don't think there's even an argument for Jarek Bernard Converse to not make the 2024 New York Jets. Their safety depth is almost just as bad. You know what? I'll say it. It's worse than the corner depth because you got Chuck Clark, who's coming off of a major injury. You got Tony Adams, and then your backups are Ashton Davis and JBC. It's just not a good room. It just isn't. That is thing number one. That is just a big shining red light at me when I look at this depth chart is that safety room. Because listen, I know we were all very excited when Chuck Clark was traded here about what he could bring from a veteran presence, right? Where he played and coming from Baltimore and the energy and the poise and the experience that he was going to bring. But then he suffered a pretty major injury. And so I just don't know what version of Chuck Clark we're going to get coming off of that major injury for 2024. And so when looking at this room, you have to look at the people behind him. And man, it doesn't exude confidence for me, this room. So I'll agree with the 4. I'll tell you what, though, Glenn, it's interesting to me because this is where I have a tough time. They took Jalen Key with their 7th-round pick, and this team made it very clear. They were open for business. You wanted a draft pick from them, you could have a draft pick from them. But they kept this pick, and they took Jalen Key. And so I wonder if there's an opportunity here for Jalen Key to battle with JBC to make this team. That is the one thing I will say. I think JBC makes the team. I don't think they can do without him, right? This is going to be his second full season with the team, and I think that is the edge that allows him to make this team over a guy like Jalen Key. But I think Jalen Key and what he's able to provide in the run game, playing at a big-time program, I would keep an eye on him to potentially be a surprise to make this team for 2024.
Yeah, well, again, when you have a position group that's that shallow, everyone's got a shot, right? Somebody makes a few plays, you got a chance to make a roster.
How many did
Let's
they
move
keep
over to
during the
corner.
season last year? I want to just take a quick look here of how many they kept. So Jordan Whitehead, Tony
Mhm.
Adams, Ashton Davis, Adrian Amos, and JBC. They carried five. They carried five safeties last year.
Yeah.
So Jalen Key making this team, I don't think is out of the realm of possibility. And I would say considering his skill set, thriving in zone, being a good run defender, right, being able to bring that thump, I think that gives him an advantage here to potentially make this team as the fifth safety.
Yeah, and it may again, teams don't like cutting draft or don't, they don't like draft picks not making the roster.
At least in
Um,
year one, right? Like
yeah,
you
exactly.
want that to give that guy a shot. Like you're telling me you're going to draft a kid, you're going to do all the work on a kid, and in April you're going to take him, and by August you're going to be like, oh, 3 months later we're done with this kid. Like teams don't operate that way.
Remember remember when they cut Jalen Saunders like week 4? I think he was like a 4th round pick, the receiver out of Oklahoma. Um, I think that's the quickest I've seen him cut a pick. Well, maybe Ja'Kai Polite too. Um,
Yeah,
but Saunders was a guy. He was going to be this dynamic return man, yards after catch guy. I think week 4 he was cut, but he had like a DUI in training camp. I think there was some major attitude issues there with him. So but it's rare you see a guy get cut that quickly. A 4th round pick. Um, Corner, not a lot to say because we kind of covered it, right? Sauce, DJ, Michael Carter, Brandon Eccles, Isaiah Oliver, Quantez Stiggers. Those are the guys I have making the roster.
yep.
I
The
think
the
that's
interest,
pretty safe.
the interesting thing I would say about Stiggers is this kid has professional experience, right? And
Yeah,
this is a unique draft selection by the Jets. This
very.
kid played in the CFL, and you can say what you want about the Canadian Football League in comparison to the quality of play in college or in the pros, but it's a professional football league, right? And so the amount of work that requires to be a professional football player at any level is high. And so I think he comes in with just a little bit of an edge over some of these other undrafted players, right? Miles Jones, Brandon Codrington, these players, I think, where the edge for Stiggers is this is a guy that has played professional football. And I think the acclimation period is not going to be as long for him, even though he was a 5th round pick. I don't think there's going to be this getting up to speed period that other rookies go through because he's played professional football. And so he is a really interesting player. Listen, Aaron Rodgers a big deal. Brees Hall, you guys know all the names. This is a kid that I'm really excited to see in training camp and in these preseason games because I think he's got an outside shot to be a really decent player for this team. I really do. I think he's gonna. If there's an injury to Sauce or DJ, he might be the first guy up.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's again, given the depth of the position, there's absolutely a path for him out of camp to win the number one backup job behind Sauce and Reed. Thomas says in the chat they added Shamar Bartholomew. He was a Georgia Southern UDFA. I haven't watched him because it's so hard to get film on these schools that are this small. Um, my info asks about Simmons at safety. Look, I said the other day the Jets don't have the cap space for. I would love it, and I think a million people have said that already. Right, like bring him in, get yourself a high level safety, even if he's lost a step. He's still an upgrade, brings veteran leadership. He's going to pick off more passes than the other guys they have on the roster. But the Jets, as it currently stands, have about $2 million in cap space. Sorry, about $9 million in cap space, and haven't started signing the rookies yet. So once the rookies are signed, they'll be down to roughly zero. Maybe a million or two, but which in NFL terms, today's money, that's about zero. But if you make some moves, as we've discussed, rework Reed, renegotiate, or restructure Quinnen and Hassan Reddick. You give him a new deal, bring their year one stat cap numbers down. Those are really the only 3 moves you can make. But it's a matter of how many moves do the Jets want to make to move money around. Charles says keep Lazard. Listen, If they think Brownlee can outplay him, and I wouldn't doubt that, I would go with Brownlee. If they feel like Lazard's the better player, fine, keep him. I have no problem with that. But I would prefer Brownlee beat him out and the Jets move Lazard and get something in return, even if it's a day 3 pick. And Charles says the Jets need a veteran safety to back up Clark. Disappointed they didn't take Jaden Hicks. Yeah, listen, there were some opportunities to get some safeties there that they passed on. So
Well, they
clearly not a
drafted
position
Jalen
Joe
Key.
Douglas values. You look at what the Jets have invested in safety since he got there, right? UDFA for Tony Adams, a 7th-round pick for Chuck Clark. Like they're not big into spending high level assets on safeties.
Yeah, I mean, listen, they drafted a safety. They drafted Jalen Key with the Mr. Irrelevant pick, so it's not like they didn't invest in the position. They took a corner, and their only 2 defensive picks were their day 3 picks. They took a corner and they took a safety. Now, do those guys make the team, and do they have contributing roles in 2024? I don't know. We'll see how the depth chart shakes out. But listen, this team was dealing from a rare case of not being in the flexible position that they're normally in. Normally, Joe Douglas is able to move around and do everything that he's able to do. And if you have not seen the series that the Jets have been doing about the offseason, the episode that they released about the draft, do yourself a favor and watch Joe Douglas attempting to move up to get Malachi Corley,
Yep.
because you can see it. And there are moments of it. And I'm not trying to be hyperbolic here, Glenn, but I wonder if you thought the same thing. There are moments where you can see the frustration in Joe's face of the position that he put himself in to not be able to move up. Because there's a moment where he tries to make a move up to, I think it's 60, and they don't want to move down to 72. They don't want to
Yep.
move down that far. And there's the frustration, and rightly so, that comes over his face when he goes, they don't want to move down that far. And I think
Yep.
that is where the realization set in of, this is a position that we created for ourselves, and it might force us to miss on the player that we want in Malachi Corley. And so it is a great watch, and hopefully everybody out there takes a peek, because you can just see the frustration on Joe's face that they didn't have the flexibility. Now, next year, they have it. They have their first, they have their second, they have their third. They got an additional third from the Lions during the draft, and I wrote about this today. I think there's a chance that one of those threes is, the top thing that they move come the trade deadline. If they feel an injury hits, or they feel they just need one extra thing to put them over the top, I think they're going to dangle that 3rd-round pick out there that they got from the Lions to a bunch of different teams to try to get maybe an additional wide receiver, some offensive line help, whatever the case may be throughout the season. Maybe there's an injury along the defensive line. They can get a pass rusher for a 3rd-round pick. I mean, I just think that 3rd-round pick was absolutely acquired not to stay with Joe Douglas in terms of having draft capital, but to be utilized during the season as a draft pick that can get them a win now player for 2024. Sorry, I
Yeah.
took us in a totally different direction.
No, it's a good point though. Having that ammunition in season or in the draft obviously could come in handy. Real quick in the chat, Thomas, agree and disagree with some of this stuff. Thomas says Isaiah Davis shouldn't have been drafted. Stigers should have been picked 257. Stigers wouldn't have been there at 257.
No.
Not the way he just played in the CFL and playing corner. He was definitely going earlier than that. Isaiah Davis, it's tough to say, small school running back. Those guys sometimes don't go, but at the same time, and we've discussed this many times, and referenced Jim Nagy at the Senior Bowl, who said multiple times leading up to this draft, because so many underclassmen declared, this was going to be a very thin draft on talent on day 3. So you would see probably a lot of guys get drafted who normally wouldn't. Bo Limmer, I like. Met and spoke to him at the Senior Bowl. Seems like a down to earth, good kid, physical in the middle of that interior offensive line. Jets obviously didn't. Flournoy was another solid receiver in Mobile who I thought could be a day 3 target. But I don't. Again, the Davis pick I didn't love, not because I don't like the player. I just felt like 2 running back. Like I so would have preferred a guy like Christian Mahogany there, who ended up not going to round 6, which was crazy. I would have preferred an interior lineman, and we just had the conversation about how they need to make a move at the interior line, or it would be excuse me, it would be nice if they did, but we'll see what happens there. What if they go with what they've got, or if they try to get one name that came up the other day, actually, Chris. I don't know if you saw this. Nate Herbig. The Steelers drafted 3 offensive linemen, so someone's going to go, and apparently Herbig would offer them $4 million in cap space. I would welcome him back with open arms. I don't know about you.
Yes, I would throw another team out there that could be a potential trade partner. And I was listening to, shout out to our good friends, Kyle and Joe, Locked On NFL Scouting. I was listening to their breakdown of the Jaden Daniels situation for 2024. And they were talking about how I asked this question honestly to you, Glenn. Have you looked at the depth chart for the Washington Commanders when it comes to their offensive line?
I have not.
They have just players all over the place. Ricky Stromberg might be available to be acquired.
I did listen to that episode. I remember hearing them talk about Stromberg.
They signed Allegretti. They signed Beatis. They signed Andrew Wiley. So they're starting left guard, center, and right tackle were all free agents. Sam Cosmi is their starting right guard. And their left tackle is Cornelius Lucas, who they signed. So, and they drafted Brandon Coleman in the third round to be their left tackle. So you got Chris Paul, Ricky Stromberg. They signed Michael Dieter. Like, call them up. What do they want for Ricky Stromberg?
That's a lot of bodies.
What do they want for Chris Paul? Like, I'll take one of these guys. I think give me Ricky Stromberg over Wes Schweitzer, personally, in my opinion. So there's an opportunity. I think a team is going to call up Washington and get a really good offensive lineman that can probably start that is listed as a backup for this team right now.
Yeah, that's an impressive list of linemen. They'd be dealing from a position of strength there. Thomas says Mahogany didn't do the bench at the combine. There's enough on film for him that I can see he is a ridiculously strong human being. And a lot of guys don't do a lot of things at the combine nowadays. It's kind of gotten annoying. And I think that's going to be a trend we see continue. I think more and more guys are going to opt to not do anything as sort of players are in position to do that. And it'll be frowned upon less and less as more, just like opting out of bowl games, like one or two guys did it. And it's like, oh my God, these guys are quitting on their team. It's going to hurt their draft stock. Now everybody does it. Now you got a bowl game with, teams, 27 different guys aren't suiting up today because they've all opted out. And that's just what's happening with college prospects. They're doing less and less. As far as Mahogany, was there an issue? Was there an injury? I don't know if there was a reason he didn't do the bench press. I would think he would have.
I don't remember off the top of my head if there's a reason why he didn't do it.
Yeah, and I know his previous injuries. I think we're knee, ACL, something like that. But that's 2 years ago. He's played 2 full seasons without an issue since then. Moving right along, Chris. Let's get into the front seven here. Let's start on the edge. Who do you like as the edge rushers, as guys to make it? Who are your fringe guys? What do you got there?
This Hassan Reddick guy, he might be a fringe guy coming.
He's got a shot. He's got to keep an eye on.
Will McDonald probably's got a shot as well. So Hassan Reddick, Will McDonald, Jermaine Johnson, Michael Clemens, the 4 locks for this position group, I would say. I mean, again, I'm going to do the thing here. I'm going to do this live while we're doing this. How many did they carry in the middle of the season last year? So let me pick November of last year.
And Clemens, they had him put on weight last year. They moved JFM. I could see them classifying him as more of a DT this year. They need help on the interior against the run.
So in November of last year, classified edges, they carried 6. They carried Jermaine. They carried JFM. They carried Michael Clemens, Carl Lawson, Will McDonald, and Bryce Huff. So they carried 6. They carried 4 guys on the interior. So they made up a group of 10 guys that were active for them during the season. So if we take that and we move over to this roster, Michael Clemens, Jermaine Johnson, Hassan Reddick, Will McDonald is 4. They've got Jalen Holmes. They've got Braden McGregor, who is an undrafted free agent.
Eric Watts out of UConn, the UDFA.
Tyreek Johnson. UDFA.
Yep.
Glenn, there's a decent chance that. Well, hold on, because their interior is interesting because it's got. Can I combine the groups here to have a conversation? Because I think
go right ahead.
Because you got Quinnen and Kinlaw, who are going to be, I think, your main 2. Your 2 backups are going to be Lecky Fotu and Solomon Thomas, right? Because Solomon Thomas is just destined to be a Jet forever, right?
Apparently.
So those 4 are your starting 4. They carried 4 last year. So with the 4 rush guys that I talked about, that's 8. So you got 2 spots for the following group: Jalen Holmes, Bruce Hector, Tanzel Smart, Braden McGregor, Tyreek Johnson, Leonard Taylor III, who was an undrafted free agent, Marquise Spencer, Eric Watts. So 2 spots for those group. Listen, I'm going to bunch them all together. Somehow 2 of those guys are going to make this team with the other 8 that I just mentioned.
Yeah, and I think the one who's the most fun is Leonard Taylor, right? Everyone's talking about him. Everybody should be. Immensely talented interior defensive lineman, a guy who some people viewed as one of the top in the country. But apparently, over time, some questions were raised about his commitment, dedication. Does he love the game? His what he did this year didn't come close to how good he was the previous year. I did read one or two pieces that suggested Miami with changes to their scheme, he was being used in a different way, similar to what we saw with Will McDonald at Iowa State, right? He had a monster year and then he has a down year and then gets drafted. But it's a weird thing, right? Leonard Taylor, a guy that talented, should not go undrafted, especially given what I just said, right? That this was going to be a week day 3, and a lot of guys who normally wouldn't get drafted will. But then you have a guy like Leonard Taylor who has top 100 talent. He goes completely undrafted. So there's the one part of you that goes, well, I'm going to be pretty cautious about this guy because I don't know what's going on, but there's clearly something there. But then there's the other part of you that goes, I also watched him play football a couple of years ago, and he is an absolute monster and could be obviously not a pick because he was a UDFA, could be the steal of this draft class for the New York Jets and plug in next to Quinnen Williams at some point. I think I actually have him making the roster based on two things: based on A, his level of talent, and B, me betting on once again this Jets defensive coaching staff that has done such a great job of developing defensive players. I think Taylor's talent. If Taylor doesn't make it, I think there's some. He's a guy that probably won't make it in the league. Like given the Jets' need there, their ability to coach guys up, if they and Leonard Taylor's talent level, if they can't coach him up to be a bottom of the depth chart guy, then I question whether or not he'll stick in the league. Braden McGregor, I love the motor. Doesn't have as much bend as you would like, but he does. I think he'll be a guy, especially on this D line, a guy who can get some pressure on the passer. I don't have him making the roster just yet, but I do have him as a yellow sort of outside looking in. Tyreek Johnson, he's one of those guys, Chris. I always think it's fun to try to go back, when you see these UDFAs get picked up and you think, oh, why don't I remember this guy's name? You watch a million different games and you take notes on all these players. Well, you don't remember Tyreek Johnson because he played like 70 snaps in college. But whatever he did, it was enough to get the Jets' attention. They bring him in. So those guys are always a little bit of fun. But yeah, I've got Hassan Reddick, I've got Jermaine Johnson, Will McDonald, and then I've got Quinnen Kinlaw. Fotu, I've got Fotu making it, but I wouldn't be surprised. Me and Dylan compared him to Tristan Colon last year. He could be that cheapish mid-level, mid-bottom of the depth chart type of guy you bring in who doesn't make the roster. Because there aren't a ton of options, I've got Fotu making it, but I would not be one bit surprised if he doesn't. And I think Clemens is going to get a chance to expand his role with JFM gone. So I've got him, Solomon Thomas, as you said, the forever Jet, and
Looks like we might have lost Glenn here for a second. Yeah, Charles says you guys froze. Yeah, I thought it was me, so I was doing some stuff in the back end, but it looks like we lost Glenn for a second. So I have texted him. Hopefully, he's able to rejoin us here in just a second. So sorry for that silence. I thought it was on my end, so I was frantically pushing a lot of buttons back here to see if it was on my end, but I ended up shooting Glenn a message. So we'll try to get Glenn back here in just a little bit so he can finish up his thoughts on the defensive line group and who he thought was going to make the team, because he was listing off all of the players and then he just completely dropped off the face of the earth after saying the four main names being Solomon Thomas, Quinnen Williams, Jermaine Johnson, and Michael Clemens. So hopefully we will get Glenn back here in a second. So while we are waiting for him, I will just move us along here. We can talk about the last group before we get to special teams. I think we're going to talk about special teams tonight as well, and that being the linebacker group. And while Glenn was talking earlier, I looked up how many they carried last year. And so last year during the season, they carried 6. Quincy Williams, C.J. Mosley, Jamien Sherwood, Zaire Barnes, Chaz Surratt, and Sam Eguavoen. I think that's how you pronounce his name. That was in November. So I'm just going to do one real quick and talk and look in in December, excuse me. Yeah, they carried 6 as well. So 6 is the number that we're kind of working off of here. And listen, if there's one position group that's probably pretty easy to be able to project, it is this group. CJ Mosley still here, Quinnen Williams still here, Jamien Sherwood, Zaire Barnes, Chaz Surratt. Those 5 I think are still here. Marcelino McCrary Ball is the new name here to this list that could potentially be that 6th safety. You also have Jimmy Ciarlo and Jackson Sermon, 2 undrafted free agents who also could be in the mix. So it's those 3 guys really. And something I wanted to mention after Glenn talked, before we lost Glenn, is we're doing this projection and we're talking about all of these different players and who's going to make the team, who's not going to make the team. And we are not forgetting, I just think it's hard for us to do this part of the process. The Jets are going to add players to this team that are not playing for this team right now, meaning other teams are going to make surprise cuts. And I mentioned it earlier with Washington's offensive line depth, but they're not going to be able to keep all of those guys. So they're either going to trade those guys or they're going to cut some of those guys, and those players are going to become available. And so when that situation happens late into the summer, think after a couple of preseason games in August, there's going to be an opportunity for this roster to look a lot different. And so there are going to be a couple of different positions in where the Jets are going to be able to have those conversations. I think corner is an area where there are going to be players cut from other teams that the Jets will look to swoop up and add to this team. Safety, another position that we mentioned earlier. The interior of the offensive line is one that we've pointed out. I wonder if wide receiver makes that list as well. So there's going to be so much ebb and flow for this roster throughout the course of the offseason. And I think what we will see is this team look a little bit different before they break camp and before the season begins. And there will be a couple of different positions where I think they'll be able to improve. So Glenn says his internet died. None of his laptops are connecting. He said to hang on. So I think at some point Glenn is going to reappear and he can join the show and share his thoughts. But I will continue on here and talk about this linebacker group. Oh, he's back. He's back.
I don't know what the hell. I don't know where I cut off. I was going on and on about Leonard Taylor and And then I was like, what do you think, Chris? And I looked up and I was just getting a little swirly and I was like, oh boy, there we go.
You were going through your predictions of who the group was. Your whole Leonard Taylor point was made, and you were going through the group, and then you said, I think you said Lecky Fotu's name, and then you completely dropped off the face of the earth. And so I initially thought it was me, and so there's a lot of silence in the video because I'm scrambling back here, I'm checking all of my equipment, I'm like, what the heck's going on?
It was my internet.
And then I texted you, and I'm like, all right, I'll pick up the show. And so I was rolling. I was talking about this linebacker group, but now that you're back, you can recap your defensive line and edge group, but then I will give you the question that I was just talking about with everybody else. Is that the hard part of what we're doing here is this roster is going to look different because players on other teams are also going to become available. So we're doing this kind of half baked, right? This is just a half approach. We've taken the cake out in the middle of baking it in the oven, where we're looking at this roster, but there are players that are going to become available from other teams where they can be added to this team.
Yeah, and that's that's the trick with it's like we say every year, right? When the 53-man roster comes out, like chill out because that's not the 53. Like that's going to change in the next 3 to 4 days while other teams, I think I heard Rick Spielman, who I cite quite a bit now because I love their podcast, the With the First Pick. And I'm sure I've heard him talk about how that's his least favorite day of the year is because you're trying to get through literally hundreds and hundreds of names of guys that are being let go and decide, are there any guys let go that we like more than our guys? And, he said, like, a lot of times you developed your guy. You may have drafted your guy, so you want to keep him, but you still have to do your due diligence and be honest with yourself. And you're going to find guys where you're like, oh, you know what? We like this guy a little bit better than the guy we kept on the roster, so we got to call that guy back and let him know he's not on the roster anymore. So there will be changes.
Yeah, 100%. Your edge group, defensive line group, if you want to just recap it.
Yeah. So it was Reddick, Johnson, McDonald on the edge. We can throw Michael Clemens. I have him as kind of a tweener. Sure. I have Braden McGregor on the outside looking in, but I think he's got a shot. Then on the interior, Quinnen, Kinlaw, Fotu, I don't know if you heard what I said about, me and Dylan. Did that get in there? Our conversation about him?
I think that might have been where you completely just fell off the face of the earth.
Yeah, basically saying he could be like last year's Tristan Colon. He could be that low-level free
Oh,
agent
yes,
who
yes,
didn't
yes, yes,
sign
yes,
for a lot
yes.
of money.
You did say this. Yes.
Yeah, so he could go. So, but I've got him making it, but wouldn't be surprised if he doesn't. Solomon Thomas, Leonard Taylor making it. Um, Guys like Manny Jones, Bruce Hector. Um, I don't see them sticking. Although Jalen Holmes, I thought looked okay for very limited snaps last year. I've got him in the yellow, like a guy who's not making it, but I could see him making it. Probably, I would say almost certainly a practice squad guy if he doesn't make the 53.
It certainly feels as though if I was going to bet on a position where the Jets are going to add from another team's cuts, edge is one of those positions.
Yeah, and that's the thing is and Charles says in the chat, sometimes you make mistakes. Look at Pinnock. Um, I didn't. I was surprised Pinnock got let go. I thought he'd hang around. I thought he played well late in his rookie year, and now he's a guy who's a regular spot starter with the Giants. So not a bad player, but the Jets obviously something in him they didn't like because it's rare. We just talked, Chris, about how you like to keep your picks. Here's a guy you drafted. He played well late in the year, encouraging signs, and they still let him go. So he's moved on to greener pastures and not a bad player.
Well, bluer pastures, I would say, because he was on.
This is true. Yes, well done, well done.
With the Giants, yeah. Linebackers, they're going to keep 6 of them, and it's probably Quincy Williams, C.J. Mosley, Zaire Barnes, Jamie Sherwood, Chaz Surratt, and Marcelino McCreary-Ball. That was my take while you were gone.
I've got Mosley. I got Mosley, Quincy, Sherwood, Surratt, and Barnes.
They carried 6 throughout the year last year. If that changes how you feel about it.
God, it really doesn't feel like they carried 6. Because C.J. Mosley never came off the field.
Neither did Quincy.
And Quincy Williams rarely did too. So I figured Sherwood is the lock. I like Sherwood. I feel like Sherwood is, at this point in his career ready to play, but he's got C.J. Mosley blocking him. I think we saw the enthusiasm Robert Saleh had for Chaz Surratt in the preseason when he was making plays. He made the roster, but he didn't really see the field at all. So yeah, it's funny you mentioned how many they carried because as I was doing the roster, I was thinking about that, and I feel like I saw 4 linebackers on the field all year, but I thought they carried more than that. So yeah, I mean, if Mosley and Williams are healthy, these guys won't play a lot. I think the Mosley thing is worth watching though, and we'll do that. We'll do more later when we rack and stack. Comparing the Jets to other teams in the AFC. But let's be honest, Mosley surprised a lot of people last year. Played at a higher level than expected after the previous year where he was a bit of a liability in coverage. I just feel like when you've got as many reps as CJ Mosley has, when you consider the mileage, the injury history, the age, I feel like he's that close to the wheels falling off. Because when that happens to older guys, sometimes it does happen overnight. And that's where I think is Jamie and Sherwood a guy who's going to end up being a starter at some point this year.
Yeah, I mean, listen, they got relatively good health out of this group last year, right? And Quincy was able to have a complete turnaround and reach the peaks, and the valleys were few and far between last year. I was the one that ate crow the most on Quincy during the season last year. But yeah, if this group stays healthy, I mean, this is one of the. I was saying while you were gone, Glenn, this is one of the easier groups to predict. This group is just it's been the same group for 3 years now, where these guys have just been here.
Yeah, and I think the Army kid, Jimmy Chiarlo, I think they like him. He's supposedly special teams guy. Again, Army's a school that it's tough to find all 22 on. I did find a couple of their games. Looked like he was a solid coverage guy. Could be a sub package backer, sometime in the future. Will he make the roster? That's hard to envision. But stranger things have happened, right?
For sure. MC3 says, is it August yet? The dog days of summer approaching, then it's training camp. I'll tell you, MC3, I understand it's the dog days. I have the amount of ideas and players that I'm planning out to watch for 2024 and some of the stuff that we want to do with the show. It doesn't feel like the dog days. There is something for me to do every day for this team looking at 2024. So
I was actually earlier today, Chris. I was because my set I've had a lot of laptops that break and some of them half break.
Tonight,
so I can still
tonight clearly one of them broke, or that was the internet.
Well, that was the Wi-Fi going down. But today I had because I have my 3 laptops in front of me and my television to the immediate right of the 3 laptops. I had 3 different college football games going today. Trying to watch some quarterbacks who I haven't seen. The Memphis kid, the SMU kid who I really liked, and someone else, I forget who else, but like literally trying to watch 3 games at once and just take mental notes and pull highlights of guys who I like as I go. So yeah, there's no off season. It just keeps going.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun, and I'm working on my positional breakdown. So I'm trying to grade where the Jets stand positionally with all 32 teams in the National Football League, where each position, like where each room stacks up. I did this last year when I was doing TDN Daily. I did it in audio format, and so maybe I'll bring it here to the show. But I've been working on that. And so that's just a lot of like research and looking at depth charts and saying, okay, this is the starting offensive line for this team going into 2024. And so there's just a lot of back end stuff to do to make that work. So there's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of stuff.
Yeah, real quick, Thomas is asking in the chat, why don't teams trade the way this is worded? Why doesn't the teams trade the draft of the guys with each other in the first few weeks after the draft? There has to be
Thomas,
some type of rules in place that I don't
I need
know
more
about.
I need more context and detail to understand what you're asking. Why
Yeah,
don't
I'm not getting what
teams
he's asking.
draft players and then trade those players a couple of weeks later because they haven't played any football for that team, so it's hard to trade players?
Yeah.
I mean, if Thomas, if you are attempting to say why doesn't this work like the NBA where they do those trades for like draft rights, because I think the way the CBA is written in football is different, so they can't do that.
Yeah. The only time, and really, again, yeah, as you said earlier, right? You're doing all the work on these guys to acquire them. You're not going to trade them before you see them. Only time you see that really is when an Eli situation. Like as you're drafting the guy, you're
Sure.
also trading him that day.
The team didn't draft Malachi Corley to on May 9th trade him to another team, right? Like that's
yeah,
just,
if that's and it could be the wording. To us, Thomas, that's what it sounds like. Okay, let's see. But if there were missed targets, team should keep. Oh, do you mean? Oh, I think I get what he's saying here. I think he's saying if there's a guy you want and you don't get him, why not go all out to get him?
I mean, some of these guys haven't signed rookie deals yet, so they can't be moved. And I don't.
Yeah, that's true. Guys
I'm
haven't signed yet,
I'm
and
not a
once they
CBA
do
expert,
sign,
but there's probably some limitation on that. If I had to take a guess.
Yeah, that makes more sense wording it that way. Here's a question for you, Chris. Way out of left field.
Okay, I love this.
Listen, I made this comment.
Are you closing the show with this?
Yeah, because it just popped into my head. The sort of outside the box thinking, because I made this comment the other day, and the man I mentioned earlier, Jim Nagy, it was on something he posted, and I made a comment and he liked it, and it was something I've genuinely thought about probably from the time I was a teenager, and I started really getting into football and kind of learning the game, right? I don't know if you saw this video that went viral of Micah Parsons taking on a sumo wrestler.
I'm familiar.
Yeah, so this sumo wrestler completely stones Micah Parsons, like just on contact, stone walls, and it almost looks like he's smiling while he's stopping him from being able to move. And I remember as a kid watching sumo one time and thinking, why don't teams try to sign like fringe sumo guys? Like go to Japan and be like, hey, dude, you're not really making it. I mean, hell, go for the big names too, right? But like bring guys, because we see these projects all the time. Oh, here's a guy who's only played the game for a couple years, but they think he can develop. Like go to Japan and be like, hey, sumo guy who weighs 310 and can do things like that to Micah Parsons. How'd you like to make some money coming over, maybe learning to play this game? Nagy joked that they were going to instill a sumo style drill in the Senior Bowl next year.
Amen.
But I commented and said I genuinely wondered as a kid watching sumo wrestlers, like why isn't someone signing this guy to be a tackle?
I'll take it a step further, Glenn, because I as a kid, like late at night, like after midnight on the East Coast, if you woke up and you turned on ESPN, they would just show the reruns of the World's Strongest Man competition, and I watched guys just push semi trucks down a street. Listen, I get that guy on my team, right? I want that guy to be to learn how to play tackle or learn how to play guard for me, right? Or be honestly, this might get me in trouble with some people, but I'll say it anyway. It's probably easier to teach somebody how to be a mauler on the interior of the defensive line than it is to probably teach them the technique of playing tackle. If I had to guess. So I would take these guys and be like, listen, put your hand in the dirt, and then when they snap the ball, just go. Just give me all of your strength in this direction.
Yeah, and even with to me, the Sumo, they're already kind of pass blocking. Like, that trait's there.
It's a version of it, right? Yeah, it is a version of pass
They get leverage and, like, let me pop up out of my stance and just get a hold of this guy and not let him drive me back, and how to set my feet and manipulate him. And I feel like there's part of it's there in place. Again, just out of left field, but I feel like we've seen crazier things. Like, we see rugby players come in.
Mm-hmm.
And those guys are normally working as running backs and receive. Like, get some linemen who know how to stand the guy up and stop his forward momentum, because Parsons got stonewalled. That was fantastic. So we'll end it on that note. We'll end it on sumo wrestlers this evening. Who was actually, when I first had the thought was, and again, this is very early. Like, I'd probably only been watching the game for a year or two, and I bought a couple packs of football cards, and I think I heard basically that it was the only Japanese player I can recall was Eugene Chung. He was an offensive tackle for the Patriots, and I remember somebody saying that he had a sumo background. Or maybe they were asking me if he did. This conversation is 30-some years ago. But ever since then, I've always wondered, like, why wouldn't you go to Japan and talk to these guys and see if you can find a project and find a player somehow? But that'll wrap this one up, the sumo. But that 53-man roster, by my count, Chris, you're looking at 3 or 4 open spots. Maybe less than that if they make some moves, if they go get Simmons, if they get, if Herbig, I'm not wanting to call him by his brother's name. You got Nick and Nate. One's a linebacker, and Nick was the linebacker at Wisconsin who went to the Steelers. Nate is also with the Steelers and is the one who played for the Jets. And I was slowing myself there to not call him Nick. So Nate Herbig, there's speculation he'll be let go because the Steelers drafted 3 offensive linemen. I think it'd be a good move. We'll catch you next week, Jets fans. Have a good one. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for jumping in the chat, guys.